All right, today we're putting on our detective hats because we're diving into one of the most critical and, honestly, one of the riskiest parts of a company's finances. It's inventory. Getting this right is so much more than just counting boxes on a shelf. It's about verifying the absolute financial health of a business. So let's get into it and crack the code.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to talk about why inventory is such a huge deal in the first place. Then, we'll get into the auditor's secret weapon, these things called assertions. They help us break the whole audit down into 3 essential questions. Is the stuff actually there? What's it really worth? And did the transactions happen in the right time period? Then we'll wrap it all up.
And this diagram right here, this is basically our roadmap for this entire explainer. It comes from the ACCA, and it lays out the whole path an auditor follows, from the big picture risks all the way down to the nitty-gritty procedures. We're going to walk through this piece by piece. Which really brings us to the main question, doesn't it? For so many companies, think retail, think manufacturing, inventory is their lifeblood. It's everything. But it's also a place where things can go wrong, really, really wrong, either by accident or on purpose. So why? Why is this one account so incredibly important and so risky to get right? Let's start right there with that fundamental why, because if you don't get the nature of inventory, you can't really get why the audit process is so intense. First thing to know, inventory isn't just one thing. You've got raw materials waiting to be turned into something. You've got work in progress, which is stuff on the assembly line, and you've got finished goods ready to be sold. When you add it all up, it's often the biggest current asset a company has. And of course, where there's that much value, there's a ton of risk. We're talking theft, damage, things just becoming outdated, or even being deliberately misstated. So how in the world does an auditor even begin to tackle all that risk? Well, they don't just wander into a warehouse and hope for the best. They come armed with a really powerful framework. It's the core of their toolkit, and it's built around something called assertions. Honestly, the best way to think about this whole thing is to picture the auditor as a financial detective. The company's management makes a bunch of claims in their financial statements. Those are the assertions. The auditor's job is to go out and gather enough evidence to either prove or disprove every single one of those claims. So here's the more formal take on it. When a company's balance sheet says, we have $10 million in inventory, they're not just stating one fact. They're actually making a whole bunch of claims all at once. They're claiming that the inventory physically exists, that it's correctly valued at that $10 million, that they actually own it, and that they've included all the inventory they have. Now, for inventory, this whole complex world of assertions really boils down to 3 big ones. We can just call them E, V, and C. That's existence, valuation, and cutoff. These 3 are the absolute pillars of a solid inventory audit. Okay, so let's tackle E first. This is the most basic, fundamental question of all. Does all this stuff they claim to have actually exist? It sounds almost too simple, but you'd be surprised. Confirming it is a huge undertaking. And that brings up a really practical problem, right? I mean, picture a warehouse the size of a football stadium, just packed to the rafters with boxes. How can an auditor possibly verify millions of different items without literally counting every single one?
Well, here's the secret. They don't. Instead, they do something that's one of the most critical procedures in the entire audit. They show up and attend the company's own physical inventory count. Their job isn't to count everything, but to observe and to verify. So while they're there, they're doing a bunch of things. They're watching the company's staff to see if their counting process is actually reliable. Then they'll do their own test counts. They'll grab a sample from the company's count sheets and go find it on the floor. And they'll do the reverse. Pick an item from the floor and make sure it's on the sheets. All the while, they're keeping their eyes peeled for things like super dusty boxes or damaged goods, which is a little clue about our next assertion. They'll also check on any inventory held at other locations. This whole process also tests for completeness, making sure every item the company owns, no matter where it is, gets included in that final number.
Okay, so we've confirmed the inventory exists. It's physically there. But that's really only half the story. Now we have to ask the much tougher question, what is it actually worth?
Because think about it, having a warehouse full of product doesn't mean a thing to investors if its value is way off. A company could have millions of items that are just obsolete or that nobody wants to buy. So how does an auditor check the dollar amount on the balance sheet? Well, this is where the valuation assertion comes into play. And the whole thing is guided by this one major accounting principle. Inventory has to be valued at the lower of cost or net realizable value, often just called NRV. It's a rule designed specifically to stop companies from overstating how much their assets are worth. Let's break that down because it's super important. Cost? That's the easy one. It's what the company paid to get the item. But net realizable value, or NRV, is what they realistically think they can sell it for, minus any cost to actually sell it. So, if your warehouse is full of last year's smartphones, the cost might have been high, but the price people are willing to pay today, the NRV, has probably plummeted. The company has to record whichever of those two numbers is lower. So the auditor's work here is pretty analytical. They'll check the company's costing method, like FIFO or weighted average, to make sure it's being used correctly. They'll dig into those NRV calculations to see if the selling prices are realistic. And remember, those dusty boxes I mentioned? This is where that observation pays off. They'll look at reports for slow-moving items and check to see if the company has properly written down the value of anything that's become obsolete. All right, we know it exists, we know what it's worth. There is one last critical piece to this puzzle, and this one is all about timing. It's called the cutoff assertion. Just picture this scenario. It's 11 p.m. on December 31st, the very last day of the company's financial year. A giant truck pulls up and delivers a huge shipment of goods. So does that inventory belong to this year's financial statements or next year's? Believe me, the answer can make a huge difference. And that is exactly what the cutoff test is for. An auditor will look at shipping and receiving documents for a few days right before and right after the year end. They're looking for a clean cutoff, making sure goods that arrived before midnight are counted in this year's inventory, and anything that arrived after midnight is counted in the next. It seems simple, but it's a vital check to stop companies from playing games with their year-end numbers. And just like that, we have all the main pieces. So let's take a step back for a second and see how this whole thing fits together to form the complete picture. So now when we look back at our roadmap, it should all make a lot more sense. You can see the complete path, right? The auditor starts by identifying the high risk that comes with inventory, and then they systematically break it down, tackling existence, valuation, and cutoff, with very specific targeted procedures. Each step builds on the last, creating a solid, defensible picture of that inventory account. But this brings us to one final, really important thought. An audit provides reasonable assurance, not an absolute 100% guarantee. So I'll leave you with this question to chew on. After all this incredibly detailed detective work, if an auditor follows every single step perfectly, what's the one risk, the one human element, that could still undermine the entire process and lead to a major problem? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me.